At first glance, Julie Dash's Four Women and Cheryl Dunye's The Watermelon Woman appear to have nothing in common. Both have unique forms, structures, and narratives. Set decades apart and abstaining from traditional classifications, it's easy to assume they're unrelated. Yet, it is precisely in the subtlety of their parallels where both films perform the strongest, and pierce the veil of disconnection between them. Neither film falls on the crutch of conventional narrative design, forward confrontation, or grand spectacle, instead utilizing performance to pry open a space for resistance. It's through this quiet, indirect approach that the poetic cinema manages. This video argues that poetic cinema, as employed by Julie Dash and Cheryl Dunye, operates as a form of punk resistance within marginalized communities. Rather than directly attacking oppression through aggressive spectacle, their films rebel by becoming both a metaphor for punk ideals and a literal demonstration of refusal of cinematic normalcy. Now, let's dive in. Both Four Women and The Watermelon Woman are centered around representation and stereotype. They explore the social hierarchical position of women, specifically women of color, for each of their respective time periods. Dash's dance performance came out in the 70s, and Dunye's mockumentary came out in the 90s. Dash, a woman who came up as part of the LA Rebellion filmmaker movement, choreographs an interpretive dance routine that artistically showcases the restrictive roles of women of color through the bodily movement and deliberate costume design. The audience watches, almost omnisciently, three women dancing almost painfully in a dimly lit room, as if to represent the socioeconomic boxes they may have been trapped in real life. The fourth woman, Peaches, serves as the metaphorical venturing out of said boxes, appearing rebellious to her circumstances. More on her later. Dunye, a young filmmaker at the cross-section of the Black experimental documentary and new queer cinema movements, indirectly exposes the lack of historical representation through her search for any archival media of the Watermelon Woman character. Heavily inspired by Dash, Dunye also includes meta-commentary in the interview sections of the mockumentary that both tell her own story and approach the larger concept of representation. The Watermelon Woman technically is found, but only in scarcity. Let's talk about differences. The most obvious are stylistic. Four Women is a short interpretive dance with intentional lighting and camera angles. Each little detail and movement adds to the narrative and contributes to the poetic feel of the video. The Watermelon Woman, however, is shot in the style of a mockumentary. It's a feature-length movie with a cast of characters played by a range of actors and actresses, whereas Dash's piece is only a few minutes long and each character is played by one single actress. Dunye's film directly attacks and exposes the issue at hand, while Dash's is more metaphorical. Both are relevant in the conversation of representation, however each fills a different niche in the commentary on oppression. Four Women's choreography is pointing fingers specifically at restrictive stereotypes and gendered roles in what used to be modern society. This is done indirectly through the characterization of each separate dancer in the video. Their movement, their clothing, even the lighting and camera angles are painting an elaborate, vulnerable portrait of each different role that women of color used to play. But the Watermelon Woman's method is more literal, more in your face. Cheryl Dunye actually places herself into the narrative, letting her tell the story to us directly. The meta-commentary in their interview sections allow her to voice her thoughts to the audience, asking herself and us questions nobody has the answers to. But let's take a step back and look at the bigger picture. Within both pieces, there's a special character whose presence isn't the focus of the piece, but that I'd like to point out. They fill the same role in the larger pictures of the works, even though the films are set decades apart. The people I'm talking about, of course, are Peaches from Four Women and Annie from The Watermelon Woman. It may not be obvious at first why these characters are paralleled, but once you look closer, you begin to see Annie as actually a sort of derivative of Peaches. They are both punk. The first usage of the word traces back hundreds of years, but as a movement, punk's roots really began around the 60s and 70s. It gained traction primarily in the UK, but it really grew internationally in the 90s, when Gen X was old enough to engage with it. Punk culture only came into its own because of the musicians propagating the angsty, anti-government mindset that accompanied the growing feeling of powerlessness in a society fueled by consumerism. Back to Peaches and Annie. Peaches' characterization is one of grit. Her character may not have any voice lines, but her movements do the talking for her. You see, Peaches' dances come off very strong, very defensive. The motions are smooth yet powerful. It implies an upbringing filled with difficulty and strife, one that has honed her into a capable woman. Her clothes are fitted tightly, yet comfortably around her body, and her hair is braided back out of her face. Her focus is performance, and it can be inferred she has a bigger, grander goal in her mind than the other characters perhaps have. And this idea is supplemented by the climactic ending of the song that accompanies her. Peaches wants change, and Peaches is ready to work for it. The bigger implications of this, obviously, is the oppression she works through. She's a woman of color in the 60s, a minority that's been trampled over for centuries. Annie, however, has much more support. She's part of the 90s punk movement, and as such, she has a much larger community to engage with. She's less hardened than Peaches, more soft. She still faces backlash. Tamara, for example, her co-worker, takes relentless digs at her character, but she's comfortable in her own skin. When Annie begins working at the video store in the movie, we immediately see her punk and scene-adjacent clothing choices. She wears dark jeans, dark lipstick, usually is wearing a spiky necklace or choker in her scenes, and has bleached bangs. She's anti-institution, likes standing out, and dislikes consumerism. Now, again, this is a side character who we only see bits and pieces of in the movie. As far as the writing goes, this is a relatively flat, underdeveloped character. However, the movement she is part of is similar to the one Peaches is part of, though with some key differences. The most glaring difference, of course, is the representation. The anti-government and anti-oppression sentiment is much more widespread in the Watermelon Woman's time period than in Four Women's. And the rebellion Annie engages in is much more accepted than Peaches' theoretical rebellion from that time period. And yet, it's obvious Annie's personality stems from characters like Peaches paving the way earlier on. Together, Four Women and the Watermelon Woman demonstrate how poetic cinema can operate as a form of resistance that is neither loud and upfront nor confrontational, yet still heavily political. Julie Dash's choreographed movement and cinematographic visuals expose the restriction on women of color, and Cheryl Dunye's introspective narration and meta-commentary allow the audience to make their own discoveries on how those same women have been excluded from history. The indirectness with which these filmmakers present their message isn't necessarily a call to action, but a beautiful, stoic homage to the marginalized characters we've lost over time and an effort toward preserving their memory. The very act of preservation in this context is, in itself, also an act of rebellion. Furthermore, the parallel between Peaches and Annie reveals how this resistance evolves over time through generations and through communities. Peaches, the physical manifestation of rebellion, dances in defiance of her oppression, while Annie's mere presence reveals to the audience the ways in which Peaches' rebellious embers grew into a wildfire in contemporary media. Ultimately, the overlaps and parallels presented from Four Women and the Watermelon Woman exemplified poetic cinema's habit of resistance and correlation to punk movements. Not only is poetic cinema a literal demonstration of the separation from normalcy, but it's also a subtle metaphor that demands representation and gives marginalized people a voice they've been denied for centuries.